The streetlights cast long shadows across Chicago's empty streets as Police Captain Wilson drove home from another exhausting shift. 20 years on the force had taught him to appreciate these quiet moments, just him, his thoughts, and the gentle hum of his personal car's engine. He'd left his police cruiser at the station, preferring to drive his own vehicle when working late. It was an ordinary sit-in, nothing flashy, just like any other car you'd see on the road. The clock on his dashboard blinked 11:42 p.m. His wife would probably be asleep by now, but she always left a plate of dinner in the microwave for him. That's just the kind of person she was, always thinking of others, just like he tried to do in his work. Tonight, though, his mind wasn't on dinner. He was thinking about tomorrow's community outreach program, something he'd spent months organizing. The program was special to him. Growing up in this city, he'd seen both sides of the badge, the good and the bad. Now, as one of the few black police captains in the department, he felt a deep responsibility to bridge the gap between law enforcement and minority communities. It wasn't just about hosting meetings or giving speeches. It was about creating real connections, about helping his officers understand the communities they served, and helping those communities see the humans behind the badges. As he drove past familiar neighborhoods, he couldn't help but smile at how far he'd come. From a kid who used to be nervous around police cars to becoming the change he wanted to see in the force. His own son was now in college, studying criminal justice, hoping to follow in his footsteps. The world is changing, he often told his officers, and we need to be part of that change. The radio played softly in the background, some old soul music that reminded him of Sunday afternoons at his grandmother's house. She'd always told him he could be anything he wanted to be, even when others doubted. Those words had carried him through the police academy, through his early days as a rookie, and now to his position as captain. He adjusted his rearview mirror, a habit from years of watching the road behind him. That's when he saw them, the flashing lights. Red and blue danced across his mirror, casting colorful shadows inside his car. He hadn't been speeding, he was sure of that. Years of law enforcement had made him especially careful about following traffic rules, almost to the point where his teenage son used to tease him about driving like a grandpa. With the practiced calm of someone who'd conducted countless traffic stops himself, he eased his foot onto the brake and carefully pulled over to the right side of the road. The street was quiet, lined with closed shops and dark windows. A few streetlights flickered overhead, their light mixing with the now pulsing police lights behind him. He did everything by the book, just as he trained countless officers to do during traffic stops. Interior light on, engine off, hands visible on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His police ID was in his wallet and his captain's badge was in his jacket pocket, but he knew better than to reach for either without being asked. Even as a captain, he never forgot the basic rules of traffic stops, rules that had been ingrained in him both as an officer and as a black man in America. Through his side mirror, he watched the police officer exit their vehicle. Something felt off about the approach, too aggressive, too tense. He could tell from the officer's body language that this wasn't going to be a routine stop. After 2 decades on the force, he'd developed a sixth sense for these situations. His mind raced through possible scenarios and responses, drawing on years of experience from both sides of the law. Tomorrow's community outreach program flashed through his thoughts. How ironic that he would find himself in exactly the kind of situation he was working so hard to prevent. The approaching footsteps grew louder, and he took a deep breath. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind, "Always keep your dignity, no matter what." He straightened his posture slightly, keeping his hands visible, and prepared himself for whatever was about to unfold on this quiet Chicago street. Through his window, he could see the officer's flashlight beam sweeping across his car's interior. His police training told him everything about this approach was wrong. The angle of approach, the aggressive stance, the way the flashlight beam lingered too long. As both a captain and a black man, he knew he was about to step into a situation that would test everything he believed in about law enforcement and change. The tap on his window was harder than necessary, almost angry. As he prepared to lower his window, he glanced one more time in his rearview mirror. The dashboard clock now read 11:45 p.m. In just 3 minutes, his ordinary drive home was about to become something much more significant, a moment that would challenge not only his patience and professionalism, but also his deep-seated belief in the possibility of change within the system he dedicated his life to serving. His finger hovered over the window control. In that brief moment before lowering it, he silently reminded himself of all the young officers he'd mentored, all the community meetings he'd led, all the progress he'd helped create. Whatever happened next, he knew it would become part of a larger story, one that needed to be told. He just didn't know yet whether it would be a story of tragedy or transformation. As he pressed the button to lower his window, the cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the weight of what was about to unfold. His 20 years of experience told him this wasn't just going to be another traffic stop. This was going to be a defining moment, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The question was, what kind of moment would it become? The window rolled down smoothly, letting in the crisp night air. The police captain kept his movements slow and deliberate, exactly as he'd taught countless young officers during their training. The flashlight beam immediately swept across his face, its harsh glare almost blinding after the gentle darkness of his car's interior. "License and registration," came the sharp command. The officer's voice carried an edge that the captain recognized all too well, not just authority, but something harder, something personal. Through the glare of the flashlight, he could make out the officer's silhouette. Young, probably in his early 30s, with the straight-back stance of someone trying to project more confidence than they felt. "Good evening, officer," the captain replied, keeping his voice steady and professional. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" It was a reasonable question, one he'd heard and answered thousands of times from the other side of the car window. But something in the officer's posture shifted, becoming more rigid, more confrontational. "I said license and registration," the officer repeated, louder this time, his free hand resting on his holster. The gesture wasn't lost on the captain. It was an unnecessary show of force, one that went against every de-escalation technique taught at the academy. The captain noticed something else too. The dashboard camera in the patrol car behind him was dark. In his 20 years on the force, he pushed hard for mandatory camera usage during all stops. It was department policy now. The missing red recording light sent a quiet warning signal through his mind. "Officer, I'm going to reach for my credentials now," he announced clearly, maintaining the calm professionalism that had become second nature over his years of service. "But first, I think you should know that I'm captain. Step out of the vehicle." The officer's command cut through the night air like a knife. The flashlight beam never wavered, but the tension in the officer's voice had ratcheted up several notches. The captain's hands remained steady on the steering wheel. "Officer, if you'd just let me show you my identification." "Out of the vehicle now, both hands where I can see them." The officer had taken a step back, his stance widening. The hand on his holster had tightened its grip. 20 years of experience told the captain that this situation was balancing on a knife's edge. He'd seen it before, taught about it in training sessions, how quickly a routine stop could spiral out of control when fear and assumptions took over. But he'd always been on the other side of these encounters, the one with the badge and authority to defuse the situation. Slowly, telegraphing every movement, he reached for his door handle. The interior light spilled out into the street as he opened the door, illuminating his pressed shirt and tie. Even after a long day at the station, he maintained a professional appearance. Another habit ingrained over years of service. As he stepped out into the street, the cool night air carried the distant sounds of the city, a siren somewhere far off, the rumble of an elevated train, the ordinary soundtrack of Chicago at night. These familiar sounds felt suddenly strange, as if he were hearing them from a different world. "Hands up. Turn around." The officer's commands kept coming, each one more tense than the last. The captain complied, his movements measured and calm, even as his mind raced through possible ways to de-escalate the situation. "Officer, I'm trying to tell you." "Stop talking. Hands on the car." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Just yesterday, he'd been leading a training session on proper traffic stop procedures, emphasizing the importance of respectful communication and avoiding unnecessary escalation. Now here he was, hands pressed against his own car, being treated like a suspect by one of his own officers. He could hear the officer calling for backup on his radio, describing a suspicious individual claiming to be law enforcement. The description made his heart sink. How many times had he heard similar calls over the years? How many times had assumptions and prejudices turned routine encounters into potentially dangerous situations? The beam of the flashlight played across his back as the officer maintained his position. The captain could hear the slight tremor in the younger man's breathing, a sign of adrenaline or fear. This was what worried him most. Fear could make people do irrational things, forget their training, see threats where none existed. A light breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying with it the first hints of approaching autumn. The captain focused on that small detail, keeping himself centered as he waited for backup to arrive. He knew that moment would be crucial. Other officers would recognize him immediately, and then this situation would transform into something else entirely. He thought about his wife at home, probably still awake despite the late hour, waiting for him as she always did. He thought about tomorrow's community outreach program, where he was supposed to speak about building trust between police and the community. The irony of his current situation would make for a powerful opening story, assuming everything ended safely. In the distance, he could hear the approaching sirens of the backup units. The sound grew louder, echoing off the buildings of the quiet street. The captain remained still, his hands on his car, waiting. In his mind, he was already thinking about how to turn this moment into something meaningful, a teaching opportunity, a chance for real change. The nearby streetlight flickered, casting shifting shadows across the scene. In those alternating moments of light and darkness, the captain reflected on how this encounter encompassed everything he'd been working to change within the department. The assumptions, the fear, the breakdown in communication, it was all here, playing out in real time on this quiet Chicago street. More patrol cars were pulling up now, their lights painting the street in rotating patterns of red and blue. The captain could hear car doors opening, familiar voices approaching. He knew the next few moments would be critical, not just for him, but for the young officer behind him, for the department, and for the larger conversation about law enforcement and community relations. As footsteps approached from multiple directions, the captain took a deep breath. Whatever happened next would ripple far beyond this single traffic stop. The question was, how would he choose to direct those ripples? The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder as backup officers arrived on the scene. Red and blue lights from multiple patrol cars now illuminated the street like a silent disco, casting strange shadows across the storefronts. The captain remained still, hands on his car, knowing the next few moments would change everything. "Hey, what's going on here?" called out a familiar voice. It was one of the night shift sergeants, someone the captain had worked with for over a decade. The footsteps stopped abruptly. "Suspicious individual, claims to be law enforcement," the young officer reported, his voice still tense but now carrying a hint of uncertainty. "Refused to show ID, acting." "Oh my God," the sergeant's voice cut through the night air. "Captain, is that you?" The atmosphere shifted instantly, like a balloon deflating. The captain could hear the sharp intake of breath from the young officer behind him, followed by a muttered word that might have been a curse or a prayer. "Stand down," the sergeant ordered, his voice carrying both authority and disbelief. "Everyone stand down right now." The captain slowly lowered his hands and turned around, facing the small crowd of officers that had gathered. Some faces showed shock, others embarrassment. The young officer who had stopped him stood frozen, his flashlight now pointing at the ground, his face drained of color. "Would anyone like to see my ID now?" the captain asked quietly, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket and pulled out his badge, letting it catch the light from the patrol cars. The gold shield gleamed, its authority now painfully obvious to everyone present. The sergeant stepped forward, shaking his head. "Sir, I am so sorry. We had no idea." He shot a sharp look at the young officer, who seemed to be trying to make himself as small as possible. "No, you didn't," the captain agreed, straightening his tie. "And that's exactly the problem we need to talk about." He looked directly at the young officer, who was now staring at the ground, as if hoping it would open up and swallow him whole. "Officer, what's your name?" The young man swallowed hard before answering. His nameplate caught the light as he shifted. "Officer Chen. First year on the force, according to his badge number." "Sir, I." Officer Chen started, then stopped, seeming to realize there was no good way to explain what had just happened. The captain looked around at the gathered officers, taking in their expressions, reading the mix of emotions on display. This was a teachable moment, but it needed to be handled carefully. The wrong approach could turn it into just another story of punishment and resentment. The right approach could make it something more valuable. Everyone except Officer Chen and Sergeant Kelly can go back to their regular patrol, he announced, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. As the other officers began to disperse, he turned his attention back to Officer Chen. Your dashcam was off, he stated simply. It wasn't a question. The young officer's face flushed. Sir, it was malfunctioning. I was going to report it at the end of my shift. The captain nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch for a moment. In the distance, a train rumbled past on elevated tracks, its rhythmic clatter providing a backdrop to the tense scene. Here's what's going to happen, the captain finally said. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp, you're going to meet me at my office. We're going to have a conversation, a real one, about what happened here tonight. About assumptions, about procedures, about what it means to wear that badge. Officer Chen looked up, surprise evident on his face. This wasn't the response he'd been expecting. Sir, aren't you going to file a complaint? Start disciplinary proceedings? The captain shook his head. That's one way to handle this. But I think we have an opportunity here for something more important. The next morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn sunshine that made the events of the previous night feel almost dreamlike. The captain sat in his office, reviewing paperwork while waiting for Officer Chen to arrive. His coffee cup sat untouched on the desk, growing cold as he thought about how to handle the upcoming conversation. Word spread through the police department like wildfire. By lunchtime, every officer in the precinct had heard some version of what happened the previous night. The break room buzzed with hushed conversations and divided opinions. Some officers defended the captain's approach to handling the situation, while others thought Officer Chen should have faced immediate consequences. The captain could feel the tension as he walked through the hallways. Years of experience had taught him to read the room, to notice how conversations stopped when he approached, how some officers couldn't quite meet his eyes. But he also noticed something else. Younger officers seeking him out, wanting to talk about their own experiences and uncertainties. One rookie stopped him in the corridor. Sir, can I speak with you for a moment? Her voice was hesitant but determined. The captain nodded, gesturing toward his office. Once inside, she spoke frankly. The thing is, sir, I've been struggling with similar thoughts. Not acting on them like Officer Chen did, but, she paused, searching for words. Sometimes I catch myself making assumptions during traffic stops, and I hate that I do it. The captain listened carefully, recognizing the courage it took to admit such things. Thank you for telling me this, he said finally. Would you be interested in joining our expanded community outreach program? Throughout the day, similar conversations played out. Some were supportive, others confrontational. A veteran sergeant cornered him in the parking lot during lunch break. You're setting a dangerous precedent, the sergeant argued. Officers need to know there are consequences for their actions. What kind of message does this send? The captain considered his response carefully. The message is that we can choose to punish mistakes, or we can use them to create real change. Officer Chen could have lost his job, and nothing would have really changed. Instead, he's going to help us build something better. Back in his office, the captain started working on revising the department's training protocols. The incident had exposed gaps in their system, not just in handling traffic stops, but in addressing the underlying biases that led to them. His phone kept ringing with calls from other precincts. News had traveled fast, and commanders wanted to know more about his approach. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. One captain from the North Side precinct asked if he could send some of his officers to observe the community outreach program. Late in the afternoon, there was a knock on his door. It was Officer Chen, looking more composed than he had that morning, but still carrying the weight of recent events. Sir, I've finished the incident report, he said, placing a folder on the desk. I wrote everything. The real reason for the stop, the dash cam, all of it. The captain picked up the report and began reading. Officer Chen remained standing, watching nervously as his superior officer reviewed his written confession. This couldn't have been easy to write, the captain said finally, closing the folder. No, sir, but it felt right, like something I needed to do. The captain nodded. You know this will go in your permanent file. Yes, sir, I understand. Good, because I want you to use this not just as a reminder of a mistake, but as a measure of how far you'll go from here. Later that evening, as the sun was setting over the city, the captain sat in his office reviewing emails from community leaders. Word had reached them too, and reactions were mixed. Some praised his innovative approach to handling the situation, while others demanded stricter action. One email particularly caught his attention. It was from the director of a local youth center, someone he'd worked with for years on community initiatives. What you're doing, the email read, is exactly what we've been talking about all these years. Real change doesn't come from punishment alone. It comes from understanding, from facing our mistakes and learning from them. I'd like to help. Our center can host some of your training sessions. Let the officers meet our kids, see them as people, not statistics. The captain began drafting his response, already seeing how this could expand their program. He envisioned officers and community members sitting together, sharing stories, breaking down the walls of mistrust that had built up over generations. His wife called, asking if he'd be home for dinner this time. I'm working on something important, he told her, explaining the day's developments. Sounds like you're building bridges, she said. Trying to, he replied, one conversation at a time. As evening settled over the city, the captain finally gathered his things to head home. Looking out his office window, he could see patrol cars heading out for the night shift, their lights cutting through the growing darkness. Each of those cars carried officers making hundreds of small decisions, interactions that could either build trust or break it. Walking to his car, he passed Officer Chen in the parking lot, heading in for his modified juvie assignment. The young officer straightened up when he saw the captain, but his posture was different now, less fearful, more purposeful. Sir, Officer Chen called out, I've been thinking about what you said this morning. About sharing our story. I want to do that. I think other officers need to hear it. The captain smiled. They will. But first, you need to understand it yourself. That's what these next few weeks are about. Driving home through the city streets, the captain reflected on how a single traffic stop had opened the door for so much potential change. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, resistance from some officers, skepticism from community members, bureaucratic hurdles to overcome. But tonight, he felt hopeful. His phone buzzed with a text from the youth center director. Training room is yours whenever you need it. Let's make this work. The captain smiled. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best opportunities for change. As he pulled into his driveway, he was already planning tomorrow's next steps. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident anymore. It was about transforming an entire system, one honest conversation at a time. The community center buzzed with nervous energy. It was Wednesday evening, exactly 1 week after the traffic stop incident, and the room was filled with an unlikely mix of people. Police officers sat scattered among community members, creating a patchwork of uniforms and civilian clothes. Officer Chen stood near the wall, trying his best not to fidget with his collar. The captain stood at the front of the room, looking out at the faces before him. Some were familiar from years of community work, others were new. All seemed to be wondering how this evening would unfold. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice carrying easily across the room. We're here tonight because we need to have some honest conversations, not just about what happened last week, but about everything that led up to it and everything that needs to change going forward. He gestured to Officer Chen, who walked to the front with measured steps. The young officer's face showed his nervousness, but there was determination there too. This is Officer Chen, the captain introduced. He has something he'd like to share with all of you. Officer Chen cleared his throat, looking out at the audience. His hands were trembling slightly, but his voice was steady. A week ago, I made a mistake, a serious one. I pulled over a car because, he paused, gathering courage, because I let my prejudices override my training. I saw a black man driving in a certain neighborhood at night, and I made assumptions, wrong assumptions. The room was silent, every person listening intently. What I didn't know was that I had pulled over my own captain. But here's the thing, it shouldn't have mattered who he was. I was wrong, period. And now I want to understand why I did what I did and how I can do better. An older woman in the front row raised her hand. The captain recognized her as Mrs. Thompson, a longtime community activist. "Young man," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "can you tell us what was going through your mind that night?" Officer Chen nodded slowly. "Fear," he admitted, "but not the kind of fear that makes sense. I wasn't afraid of any real threat. I was afraid of what I'd been taught to be afraid of without even realizing I'd been taught it." A teenage boy in the back spoke up. "That's how we feel too, you know. Every time we see police lights in our rearview mirror. Fear that doesn't make sense, but it's there because of what we've learned to expect." The captain watched as understanding flickered across Officer Chen's face. This was why they were here, for these moments of connection, of shared understanding. A veteran officer stood up next. "I've been on the force for 15 years, he said, "and I'm going to be honest. I've had those same thoughts, made some of those same assumptions. The difference is, I never had to face them like this. Maybe it's time we all did." The conversation flowed more freely after that. People shared stories, both good and bad experiences with law enforcement. Officers talked about their fears and uncertainties. Community members spoke about their hopes for change and their frustrations with the system. One young officer admitted to struggling with similar biases. An elderly gentleman shared a story about a positive interaction that had changed his view of the police. A mother talked about teaching her children how to act during traffic stops, her voice breaking as she described her fears for their safety. The captain moderated the discussion, but mostly he listened. He watched as barriers began to break down, as people started to see each other as human beings rather than uniforms or stereotypes. Halfway through the evening, they broke into smaller groups. The captain observed as Officer Chen sat with a group of teenage boys, listening intently as they described their daily experiences. The young officer's face showed genuine shock at some of their stories. In another corner, veteran officers were engaged in deep conversation with community elders, comparing perspectives on how the neighborhood had changed over the years. The dialogue wasn't always comfortable, but it was real. As the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. People who had started the night on opposite sides of an invisible divide began finding common ground. They discovered shared concerns about safety, shared hopes for their community, shared desires for understanding. Near the end of the session, a young girl raised her hand. She couldn't have been more than 12. "My brother wants to be a police officer," she said, looking directly at Officer Chen. "What would you tell him?" Officer Chen was quiet for a moment, considering his response. "I would tell him that it's a big responsibility," he finally said. "That he'll need to work hard not just at learning procedures and laws, but at understanding people. And that he'll make mistakes, but what matters is how he learns from them." The captain stepped forward then. "That's why we're all here," he added, "because change doesn't happen in one night or through one conversation. It happens through many conversations, through willing to be uncomfortable, through admitting our mistakes and working to do better." As the meeting wound down, people lingered, continuing discussions in small groups. The captain overheard snippets of conversation, officers making plans to attend community events, residents offering to speak at police training sessions, young people and officers exchanging perspectives on how to improve neighborhood relations. Officer Chen approached him as people were leaving. "I didn't expect it to be like this," he admitted. "I thought they would all hate me." The captain smiled slightly. "People can surprise you when you give them the chance. That goes both ways, doesn't it?" Later, as they were stacking chairs and cleaning up, the youth center director approached them. "This was just the beginning," she said, "but it was a good beginning." The captain nodded, watching as the last few participants headed out into the night, still deep in conversation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight had shown what was possible when people were willing to listen and learn from each other. As he locked up the community center, he could see Officer Chen standing in the parking lot, talking with some of the teenage boys from earlier. They were laughing about something, the earlier tension completely gone. It was a small moment, but sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments of connection. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The autumn chill had given way to winter snow, then spring rain, and now early summer sunshine streamed through the windows of the police academy classroom. The captain stood at the podium, looking out at the fresh faces of new recruits with Officer Chen by his side. "What you're about to hear," the captain began, "is a story about a traffic stop. But it's really about much more than that. It's about the choices we make, the assumptions we carry, and the change that's possible when we're willing to learn from our mistakes. Officer Chen stepped forward, his stance confident but humble, very different from the nervous young officer of 6 months ago. "I was the officer who made that traffic stop," he said, his voice clear and steady. "And I'm here to tell you how it changed not just my career, but my entire perspective on what it means to serve and protect." The room was silent as Officer Chen shared his story. He didn't hold back. He described his assumptions, his fears, his mistakes. He talked about turning off his dashcam, about escalating a situation unnecessarily, about letting bias override training. But then he talked about what happened next, about the captain's choice to teach rather than punish, about the community meetings that opened his eyes, about the relationships he built with the people he'd once viewed with suspicion. "Last week," he told the recruits, "I was patrolling the same neighborhood where this all started. A teenager flagged me down, one of the boys from our community meetings. His basketball had gotten stuck on a roof. 6 months ago, those kids wouldn't have dared to ask a police officer for help. But there I was, getting a ladder from a neighbor, helping retrieve that ball." The captain watched the recruits' faces as they absorbed the story. Some nodded in recognition of their own hidden biases, others wrote furiously in their notebooks. "The program we started," the captain added, stepping forward, "has now been adopted by 3 other precincts. Over 200 officers have gone through the community engagement training. But more importantly, we're seeing real changes in how officers and community members interact." He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics. Complaints about officer conduct had dropped significantly. Community trust ratings had improved, but the numbers told only part of the story. 2 months ago, Officer Chen continued, "We had our first community basketball tournament, police officers and local teenagers playing together. The gym was packed. People who once viewed each other with suspicion were cheering for the same teams." A young recruit raised her hand. "But how do you handle the officers who resist these changes, who don't want to confront their biases?" The captain nodded at the thoughtful question. "Change isn't easy," he acknowledged. "We still face resistance. But we've found that the most effective approach is to let officers see the results for themselves. When they witness their colleagues building genuine connections with the community, when they see how much easier and more effective their jobs become with community trust, that's what changes minds." Officer Chen shared some of his own challenges. "I still catch myself sometimes, starting to make assumptions. The difference is, now I recognize those thoughts and question them. And I have relationships with people in the community that help me see beyond those initial judgments." The presentation continued with practical scenarios, role-playing exercises, and discussions about implicit bias. But it wasn't just theoretical. They shared real stories, real experiences, real changes that had occurred over the past 6 months. During the break, several recruits approached Officer Chen to talk more. The captain overheard one asking how he handled the shame of his initial mistake. "The shame doesn't go away completely," Officer Chen replied honestly. "But I've learned to use it as motivation to do better, to be better. And when I see the positive changes happening in our community, it helps me remember that mistakes can lead to growth if we're willing to learn from them." Later that afternoon, they'd visited the community center where it had all started. The walls now displayed photos from various police community events: the basketball tournament, a neighborhood cleanup day, a youth mentoring program. Mrs. Thompson, the community activist from that first meeting, was there to greet them. 6 months ago, she told the recruits, "I wouldn't have believed this was possible. But here we are." She gestured to a group of children playing nearby, completely at ease despite the presence of several uniformed officers. The captain watched as Officer Chen joined a game of cards with some teenagers. They teased him about his terrible poker face, and he laughed along with them. It was a small moment, but it represented everything they'd been working toward: genuine human connection replacing fear and suspicion. As the day wound down, the captain gathered the recruits for a final thought. "The badge you'll wear represents power and authority," he said. "But true power comes from understanding, from connecting, from serving your community in a way that builds trust rather than fear." Officer Chen added his own perspective. "That night 6 months ago, I thought I was just doing my job. Now I understand that our job is about so much more than enforcing laws. It's about building bridges, about seeing the humanity in everyone we serve." The sun was setting as they left the academy, casting long shadows across the parking lot. A group of kids rode past on bikes, waving to Officer Chen. He waved back, calling them by name. The captain smiled, remembering that tense night 6 months ago. One traffic stop, one mistake, one decision to choose teaching over punishment. It had sparked changes nobody could have predicted. "Ready for tomorrow's community meeting?" he asked Officer Chen as they walked to their cars. "Actually, yes," Officer Chen replied. "We're planning the summer youth program. Some of the teens have great ideas for building better relationships between kids and officers." As they drove away, the captain reflected on how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. Change happened slowly, one conversation at a time, one connection at a time. But it did happen as long as people were willing to learn from their mistakes and work together for something better. That night's traffic stop could have ended very differently. Instead, it had become a story of transformation, not just for one officer or one department, but for an entire community. And the story wasn't over yet. It was still being written, one day at a time, by every person who chose to be part of the change.